those who you see helping out here today. Before we jump to our first panel, I want to recognize just a few guests. I see Justice Martha Walters walking in, Judge Wogan, and former County Commissioner Pete Sorensen. So welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm now going to turn the program over to Professor Kristen Bell, who's going to moderate our first panel.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you all for joining us today. It's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers. Today, we're going to be talking about the Grants Pass case out of the U.S. Supreme Court, and we are very lucky to have Ed Johnson with us here over Zoom. He is the Director of Litigation at Oregon Law Center, where he's been a legal aid lawyer in Oregon for 30 years. His work focuses on fair housing, subsidized housing, housing preservation, and homeless rights litigation. He filed the case Johnson v. Grants Pass that eventually made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Oregon Law Center sued on behalf of Gloria Johnson and other homeless individuals, alleging the city's camping and sleeping ordinances violated the 8th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Mr. Johnson also holds a JD from Columbia School of Law. And we are also joined today by my colleague Laurie Hauber, who is the Director of Experiential Education and an Assistant Clinical Professor here at University of Oregon School of Law. She previously worked at the Oregon Law Center, focusing on affordable housing and homelessness issues. And her recently published article, Criminalization of the Unhoused, a case study of alternatives to a punitive system, appeared in Georgetown Journal of Poverty Law and Policy. She holds a BA from Hauber College and a JD from Boston College Law School. And before I turn things over to Ed Johnson, I just want to say how lucky we are to have this panel to talk about Grants Pass. These are truly the experts on the legal issues and the contextual issues surrounding homelessness. I have taught the district court case out of Grants Pass for the last 2 years in criminal law. If you were in my criminal law class, you would have had it in your casebook. And I taught it for the very simple proposition that every crime has to have an actus reus, a voluntary act, which I describe to students as meaning that it has to be some kind of behavior over which there's some kind of control. There has to be some option to do otherwise. If you have no option whatsoever to do otherwise, there's no sense in which you have a doing, some kind of voluntary act. You are just punishing someone for resisting the way they are. So I now am in the process of editing my casebook because the U.S. Supreme Court has changed course on this, and we will learn more about that from the expert Ed Johnson, so I'll let you take it away from here.
Thank you, Kristen, and I was hoping to be there in person today, but apparently COVID is still a thing, so I'm holed up in my apartment in Portland. I'm going to start with my conclusion, even though that may not be the way that these things usually start, but homelessness is an economic problem, and more specifically, it's a housing problem. What it is not is a criminal justice problem. I'm going to give a short description of this case, which may be somewhat challenging since it has occupied much of the last 7 years of my life, but I'm really glad that this panel is forward-looking. This is a very scary time for our homeless neighbors in Oregon and across the country, and we all have a role to play in making sure that the most vulnerable people in our communities are cared for, and really more broadly deciding what kind of communities we want to live in. And I think this is a real crossroads, and in my opinion, there is a wrong way we can turn and there is a right way we can turn. But first, the Grants Pass case. I think most of you know Grants Pass is about 2 hours down I-5 from where you are, 4 hours from where I am. It's a small city that, like most cities in the West Coast, experienced a population explosion in the early 2000s. The population of Grants Pass in 2000 was 23,000. In 2020, it was 39,000, so a 60% increase. Also, like most West Coast cities, Grants Pass was unable to keep up with the housing it needed to house its increased population. What's a little different about Grants Pass than some places is that throughout some of those years, elected officials actively discouraged the building of affordable housing or really multifamily housing at all in Grants Pass, and I have read recently that that may be changing, so let's hope that it is in Grants Pass. The result of that housing crisis and population explosion is that all of a sudden in Grants Pass there were hundreds of people who were previously housed in Grants Pass who've been forced to live outside. And so in 2013, city leaders got together to talk about what they could do about this problem. And we have the minutes of that meeting in the record in this case. It's very discouraging to read because there was no offered solutions for how to help the people who had been forced to live outside. Instead, all of the conversation was about how to get rid of these hundreds of people who could no longer afford housing in a community. And the city leaders brainstormed ideas including putting people on a bus to another community, putting up signs expressing zero tolerance for homelessness in Grants Pass, making a list of the most unwanted people in Grants Pass, cutting off services to people. And what they ultimately landed on was a stepped up enforcement scheme of several ordinances that collectively made it illegal for people to live outside on every inch of public land 24 hours a day with as little as a blanket or a tarp or a pillow or a piece of cardboard to keep themselves warm and dry and really alive during the cold months in Grants Pass. And that's what they did. And our office down in Grants Pass started to hear from people who were experiencing this enforcement scheme. They were being awakened at all hours of the day and night, literally the middle of the night, and told that there was nowhere they could be in the city and that if they stuck around, they would be arrested. Most people had no ability to go anywhere. Many were arrested and put in jail for criminal trespass. Many more were ticketed and fined $295 on the front end, and then when those tickets inevitably went unpaid, they became $530 fines. So we sued them. It's an important piece of the backdrop that Grants Pass had and has no homeless shelter where people can show up and get a bed for the night. The lawsuit that we filed in the District of Oregon in Medford was a class action, and that class action was certified. So throughout this process, we were representing all of the homeless individuals in Grants Pass. There were cross motions for summary judgment, and we prevailed on 2 Eighth Amendment claims. One, violation of the Cruel and Unusual Punishments Clause, and another one, a violation of the Excessive Fines Clause. The city appealed the Cruel and Unusual Punishments Clause decision, and the Ninth Circuit, initially in a 2-to-1 panel decision, affirmed that, consistent with Martin v. Boise, cities like Grants Pass cannot make it illegal everywhere at all times for people to sleep outside if they have nowhere else to go. The other relevant case I just want to mention, I think it may come up in the rest of our discussion, is Robinson v. California, a case that the Supreme Court decided in 1962. That case held that the government cannot punish a person based on their status. In that case, California made it illegal for people to be addicted to narcotics, regardless of whether or not they had actually used narcotics. Just the status of addiction was made illegal, and the Supreme Court held that violated the Cruel and Unusual Punishments Clause. After the panel decision, the Ninth Circuit, in a very narrowly divided decision, decided not to grant en banc review. I think en banc means all the judges. I don't think it does mean that, but they decided 14 to 13 to not hear the case en banc, but many judges wrote decisions disagreeing with that. And I believe it got the Supreme Court's attention. The Supreme Court granted cert at the city's request in January, and the Supreme Court, of course, as you probably know, reversed on the sole issue of whether or not the cruel and unusual punishments clause is violated by this kind of enforcement scheme. They held 6-3 that it does not violate the cruel and unusual punishments clause. So I will leave it there and pick it up after Laurie talks a little bit.
Thank you, Ed. I, of course, have many questions, but I'll withhold my questions for now. So, just to take a step back and look at the larger context. I mean, as Ed mentioned, the futility and the cost of relying on an enforcement scheme when for people who are unhoused, unsheltered, and have nowhere else to go, because it is, I won't use the term status right now, but it does nothing to solve the problem of homelessness. All it does is it creates barriers, more barriers, for people to be able to transition out of homelessness, access to housing, access to more stable employment, public benefits. All of these become more difficult when you have fines that just continue to accumulate and you have an arrest record. And then using law enforcement as the primary tool to address our homelessness crisis also is an incredible drain on cities' resources. And there are numerous studies that show definitively that the cost on cities to enforce home laws against people who are unhoused due to their unhoused status is far more costly than providing housing. And so one of the things from this case is not only does it not help address the crisis, but now we're potentially diverting more resources away from actually addressing the issue and putting it toward enforcement. And police are not the front lines. Police aren't trained to work with people who are unhoused. So there's a myriad of issues. The other thing I just want to add, and I was listing all the things I find so offensive in the majority opinion, and I might even say somewhat erroneous, but suggesting that fines are not that big of a deal, and a $200 fine is a nominal amount of money, for someone who is unhoused, it's not a nominal amount of money. But I also want to point out, as Ed said, the fines multiply when they're not paid. And not only do they multiply when they're unpaid, they eventually end up in collection agency where those fines are just compounded day after day. And I worked with people who a $200 fine 10 years later was over $1,000. And so I want to stress that it's not just about arrests, but fines are also a real problem. And so I just want to, I'm going to pull up slides. So sorry, I'm going to make you small for a few minutes. So I just want to, I'm not going to read these off, but I want to show just kind of what the homelessness landscape looks like around the country. And as Ed acknowledged, we are in a crisis. So that's 653,000. First of all, that's across the country. That is just one day. It's a count that happens one day a year in January. And kind of advocates around the country say, and there's evidence that shows that the more accurate count, we're talking in the millions. And so, and I think, especially on the West Coast, we see this. And then the other thing is, for the first time since the federal government started counting the number of people who are unhoused, the majority of individuals are actually also unsheltered. And like I said, this is the first time. And so the unsheltered is growing at rates beyond any city's ability to address. And then just as you can see, I mean, just children alone, the numbers are appalling. And then this is a few data points just on Oregon. And so this is kind of the big picture. And then, as Ed said, homelessness is a housing problem. And I just want to emphasize that. That is the #1 cause of people who become homeless. And that is often driven by unaffordable rents and people evicted because of lack of protections. And so I put the second bullet point on the slide, just there is a direct correlation, and these are national studies that show that the correlation between a rent increase and the increase in homelessness. And so now these are the main data points I wanted to share, so now we can bring that back. But so the lack of options for people who are unhoused, cities can't transition people into housing because we don't have enough housing. And so what else? So that's housing. And we're gonna come back to housing probably a few times. And then second most common cause is stagnant wages. And so lack of a living wage is a real problem. And then as the court mentioned, even the majority acknowledged, victims of domestic violence have a much higher incidence of homelessness, as well as medical expenses, bankruptcy, and untreated mental illness. And then the other, if you know, substance abuse is not on that list. And that is a very common misperception. Substance abuse is often a consequence of being forced into homelessness, not a cause. So, and then I don't have the slide up any longer, but one of the issues, especially in Oregon, we are last in terms of the number of treatment facilities we have, yet we have the highest addiction rates in the country. So this is to kind of set the stage and provide that context, and also just kind of then allow Ed to segue back to more details about Grants Pass and talking about encampment sweeps.
So it's way too early, I think, to try to predict what all the implications of this decision are going to be. I think it'll take years to figure that out. But after 2+ months, it's mostly bad news, especially for our neighbors who've been forced to live outside. But there are some significant glimmers of hope that I want to talk about. I also just want to touch briefly on the legal remedies that are available, but I really want to get back to what Laurie was talking about, which is the real cause and solution of this crisis. But both Justice Gorsuch and, to a greater extent, Justice Sotomayor in her dissenting opinion, talk about all the different legal remedies that might still be available to houseless Americans who are being criminalized. And I have this image in my head that the law is a long hallway with lots and lots of doors. And one of the doors was just bolted shut by the Supreme Court for now. But there are a lot of other doors. And civil rights attorneys and legal aid lawyers are going to continue to walk through those doors with their clients and, if necessary, knock those doors down. I'm not going to list all of the possible legal claims, but there are many state and federal legal claims that remain besides the Cruel and Unusual Punishments Clause. The problem with all of those claims, at least the ones that I'm thinking of, as Laurie said, they don't address the crisis of homelessness. They ameliorate and sometimes they save lives, but they ameliorate the effects of criminalization on people who have been forced to live outside. So they're important, but they're not going to solve this problem because they don't provide people with a home. Just to add another statistic to Laurie's statistics, the latest estimate I saw said that the United States of America is 7.2 million housing units short of what it needs to house its population. We're the richest country in the history of the world. There's no way to look at that number and not see decades of failed policy decisions. I mean, this is a systemic failure, and we can't litigate our way out of that. Certainly we cannot police our way out of that. And so that's the backdrop against which we have to make decisions as we go forward. Cities who are saying, and governors and others who are saying that they're going to get tough on homelessness in light of this decision are engaged in a dangerous political stunt, because many of them know, but whether they know or not, that will not work. What that is going to do is put people's lives in jeopardy. It's going to cause panic and suffering. And at the end of the day, if we go down that road, we're going to have more of our neighbors who've been forced to live outside and have been unable to stabilize enough to get inside. And, unfortunately, the bad news is there have been a flurry of cities in the last 2+ months who have decided to make their sweep policies, which this case was not specifically about, but also their punishment schemes more severe. And they're doing that, in my view, because constituents are demanding it of them, but no one who has looked at the data and of these situations could reasonably say that that is going to solve the situation. There's been a lot of talk about people being shelter resistant, and I think the reality is that a lot of shelters are people resistant. When we say that people decline services, we need to look at what kind of services we're really offering people. There's also a little bit of, the fact that many of these cities have one shelter bed for every 5 to 10 homeless people, and they're saying that people are shelter resistant is hard to justify. But it's not all bad news out there, and I want to spend a couple minutes talking about the good news, because we have to get organized and move forward. It's tempting. The status quo right now is so unacceptable. It's tempting to just be depressed, but there is a path forward, and it's being shown to us in various ways. But the short answer is we need more permanent, supportive, affordable housing. And, that word supportive means that some people need more than housing. People who attack housing first and say that there are a lot of people living outside who aren't ready to succeed in housing miss the point of supportive housing. The system that we provide people has to account for mental health issues and struggles with addiction for everyone to be able to succeed. But we know it works. Where it's been tried, it works. If you look at the HUD-VASH program, we have been able to reduce veteran homelessness by more than half because we have done exactly this. We have essentially integrated supportive housing with comprehensive services. Other cities that have tried this to varying degrees have seen a decrease in homelessness, sometimes a drastic decrease in homelessness. And it's places all over the country, some places you might not expect. Houston, Chattanooga, Seattle, LA City and County, which apparently there are 88 cities in LA County. LA has long been put forward as a failed example on this because of how severe the homelessness crisis is. But right now their homelessness numbers are dropping because they're doing the only thing that works, and they're sticking with it despite this Supreme Court decision. Providing these coordinated services with robust housing support is the answer. There are other things that are also part of the answer, and I'll just tick off a few and then hand it back to Laurie. But there's bipartisan support for zoning reform in many states, including Oregon. And I don't understand zoning. I'm sure there are people in the audience who do, but I understand it enough to know you got to have a place to build this affordable housing, and it involves increased housing density. It's not just the funding, which I'm going to talk about in a second, but it's also you got to have a place, you got to have sites, you got to get rid of the NIMBYism, and then you have to have somebody to build it. Somebody was telling me we've disinvested in the construction industry so much, there aren't enough people in Oregon who know how to build multifamily housing, even if we get over those other hurdles. But those are things that we can do. Those are solvable problems. And so I'm going to hand it back to Laurie, but I do just want to mention, one more part of our path forward is we can also focus on keeping people inside who are inside. And what we learned during the pandemic is that those rental protections work. Many of them have lapsed, but here's the secret, they still work. And we need to not only be working with people who are outside to make sure they get inside and have a safe place to live, but we need to be working with people who are barely housed and just hanging on and make sure that they stay housed.
Thanks, Ed. And I will add directly from that, with respect to housing, just between 2022 and 2023, across the country, there was a 9.7% increase in the number of people who are unhoused, and that coincides with the lifting of rental protections that were in place during COVID and after COVID. So I want to go back one for a bit, and then I want to add on to some of the more kind of add on to Ed's picture of hope. But so one thing I remember about the kind of the autonomy of local governments that was raised in the case, and that was raised with so many of the briefs that were filed by cities, that cities still have the ability to regulate the time, place, and manner. So for people who are sleeping outside. So it's not as if cities don't have control over basically every aspect of someone who is unhoused thereby. And then the other thing to remember is, and the case makes, the dissent makes this clear, is we're only talking about the status of being unhoused. It doesn't take away a city's ability to regulate the conduct. And even just disorderly conduct alone is, as we probably all know, is applied so broadly. So I just want to point that out, because I think the argument that this impedes this, it takes away a tool in a city's toolbox, is fairly specious. And then, so moving on to adding to what Ed was talking about, as we both are saying, and probably the one takeaway theme, hopefully all of you get from this, is we need more housing. And there's proven housing models that work, as Ed talked about. The other thing is, I mean, arguably where we are as a country right now, housing alone is not the solution, and certainly not in the short term, especially given the issues around zoning and kind of how complicated it is to build permanent supportive housing and other forms of housing that help people transition from homelessness. But one thing I want to point out, taking a step back historically, we didn't have a homelessness crisis. We didn't have a large number of people who were unhoused prior to the 1980s. And in the 1980s, what we saw was a significant reduction in federal funding toward affordable housing. And that reduction, we've never gotten back to the pre-1980s level. And so that, it's something where it just speaks again to housing. Housing is kind of the key answer in this. So I would say, in addition to housing, though, there's support at the federal government for homeless services centers. And 23 cities around the country through HUD have been awarded kind of this designation. And there's a lot of money and then human resources going toward efforts like street outreach, which is the appropriate response for people who are unhoused. And then it's street outreach who can help transition people to housing and also just access to services. And so there's kind of a list of services that reach people who are unhoused, and as Ed talked about, in the majority opinion, talks about resistance to service, resistance to shelter. Well, there is resistance with when the first responder is a police officer instead of a trained outreach worker. And then the other thing is non-congregate shelter sites, because as Ed mentioned, the issue is not necessarily people not wanting to move into shelters. It's more the shelters just don't accommodate such a wide range of people, and some of the issues, even something so basic as dogs, and prohibiting dogs. But so one of the things I think we need to think about, and now I'm putting this on all of you, but it's how we can create spaces for small groups of people to live together. And because those small non-congregate shelter communities have been shown to be successful, and a higher percentage of people are able to transition into housing from those kind of smaller sheltering arrangements where services are provided and people are in kind of a stepped pathway in back into housing. And then in terms of even plugging in to as lawyers how you can get involved, as Ed mentioned, litigation really is not the answer, but there are both sides kind of leave the door open to certain kinds of constitutional claims. Then there's also a fair amount going on, even just in law school clinics around the country, citation defense work and representing individuals. That is not the macro answer, but there are things that each of us can do to help contribute to a solution. And then there's an effort both at state levels and city levels to introduce legislation post-grants pass that basically kind of acknowledges that the solution isn't just citing people and arresting people for camping outside. And so that's an effort that's happening, and you might have more data on that than I do, but it's certainly happening in various places, and certainly various places in the Ninth Circuit. So, I guess what I'll say, and I've said it so many times, is just this decision does nothing to help address the root causes of homelessness and to address meaningful solutions to the crisis. And so I leave it at that, and I encourage all of you to follow up if you are interested in finding ways to plug in, whether it's city, state, national level.
Thank you. So we have exactly 10 minutes for questions. If you want to raise your hand, you can ask a question. If you are on the webinar, you can type your question in, and Jennifer Geller will be able to read your question out to the group. Also, if we don't get any immediate questions, I'll ask our two panelists if they have questions for each other. Yes.
I've heard the terms homeless, unhoused, and unsheltered used. Sometimes it seems interchangeably, but sometimes more nuanced. Can you add some definition to that?
Well, I guess Ed, I'll start, and if you want to add to this. So homelessness in general is defined by HUD as not having a fixed, regular, adequate nighttime residence. That's And so that includes people who are doubling up. A lot of times, particularly with families, that's what happens. People are doubling up. That's part of the count of homelessness. And homelessness and unhoused are used interchangeably. Unhoused is more accurate, and I think a lot of people who are advocates on behalf of the unhoused prefer that term. And then unsheltered is a subsection within that. People who are literally on the street, they have their only form of shelter is a blanket, a tent, or living in their car. So Ed, do you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I do think there's sometimes the terminology is confusing and confuses the substance, but I use homeless, houseless, and unhoused interchangeably along with forced to live outside. I noticed that like more lawyers and providers say houseless than people I meet outside when I'm doing outreach. They almost unanimously refer to themselves as homeless. But I think the key distinction when you look at point in time counts and other statistics is the one that Laurie made between sheltered and unsheltered homelessness. I mean, there are, in addition to the hundreds of thousands of unsheltered homeless Americans, there are millions of people who are couch surfing, precariously housed, just barely hanging on to having any kind of roof over their head, and usually they don't have a legal right to be where they're staying.
Question there?
So I have inside information, Laurie, that you used to be a legal aid lawyer, and that you assisted homeless people. Can you talk a little bit about the day-to-day experience, the impacts of not having a settled place where you have to move every day on your ability to work, because many of them do work, or your ability to access services?
Well, thank you for setting me up for that. So yes, I moved over to the law school from legal aid, and while I was at legal aid, I was very active under John's mentorship, very active working with people who were unhoused. And this happened right after Martin v. Boise was passed, and there was a lot of stir kind of up and down the West Coast in this states that comprise the Ninth Circuit, and people who were unhoused started saying, well, we need a lawsuit, we need to sue the city, we need to sue the county. And so you don't undertake an impact litigation lightly, and so part of what I was doing was trying to understand the extent of the issues in Eugene. I focus in Eugene, not the county. And so in doing that, I spent a lot of time, at the time, some of you who have been here probably remember what was loosely referred to as Camp 99. And so that was where over 100 people who were unhoused were put together in a very small space. And as you can imagine, it didn't work very well because of the number of people. And the barriers are, I mean, probably kind of common sense, but when you're unhoused and you are holding on to your only possessions that remain, it's difficult to go to work, it's impossible to apply for a job. Where do you leave your belongings that are safe? And then even just going through the process of finding housing is that's virtually impossible. And so creating communities of people living together is actually part of what I learned from this experience, is part of what helps people get back on their feet. That support from other people who are unhoused is invaluable. And I met people who said for the first time they could leave their stuff safely and go to work. And as John said, a large percentage of people who are unhoused have some kind of a job. It's not stable enough, and it doesn't pay a large enough income to then save for a deposit, first and last month rent. And so these are some of the issues that just create barriers that make it so hard to transition into housing. And then just, Ed talked a little bit about sweeps, but then police come in, sweep an encampment, and even though there are laws about not taking people's belongings, the way it plays out is often people lose their belongings. That's their identification and all other essential items. And then there's medication issues. So I think my long-winded answer to this is, one, there are so many barriers once you become unhoused. And so when you, especially when you see what looks like able-bodied young adults who are unhoused, there's so many reasons why people who present as potentially able to work can't do so because of all of these reasons. And so the notion of, well, they just need to get a job it's just not in reality the way it works.
So we do have a question in the webinar. Mr. Johnson, is it your position that the SCOTUS ruling in Grants Pass was wrong on the 8th Amendment?
Yes. That's not probably surprising, but you know, it overturns decades of precedent around the issue of whether governments can punish somebody based on an involuntary status. And in my view, punishing somebody for living outside is literally the definition of punishing someone based on their status. You know, addiction, if anything, is trickier. People struggling with addiction overcome the urge to use every day. It's not easy, but they overcome the urge to use every single day. There's no overcoming the urge to live outside if you're homeless in America in a community that doesn't have any place for you to live inside. And so I believe it was wrongly decided under the 8th Amendment.
Jen?
One issue that was brooded about in oral argument but not really discussed in the opinion is whether it's okay for the government to say, we don't want you living in our town anymore, right? And obviously a lot of homeless people in a given community are from there or even have jobs there. And there was dialogue during oral argument where the Chief Justice was like, well, what if another town is not far away? Could we just make them go to the other town? Is there any way to convert that into another legal challenge to some of these, that if the intent, as it clearly was in Grants Pass, is to make people leave, that there's just nothing in our constitutional tradition I'm aware of that makes it okay to say to people, you can't live in this town. Maybe that's a dead end, but you know, we're all sort of scrabbling for hope, you know, and this is my Scrabble.
I mean, I agree with that, and I just want to clarify one thing that Laurie said. It's not that litigation isn't the solution, it's just that it's not the solution to homelessness overall. I think it is the solution to the criminalization of homelessness. And, you know, this banishment race that we may be seeing the beginning of is going to raise all sorts of substantive constitutional issues, you know, fundamental rights, and also just as a practical matter, it's going to be very expensive and tragic to watch as cities try to banish people, because it's not like the town next door has a lot of vacant shelter beds, no matter where it is that we're talking about. People have to go somewhere, and this road that we're headed down, I think, is very dangerous.
And this is a practice, just to add to that, that has been happening for years. I mean, when I lived in St. Louis, it was very common for cities to give people one-way bus tickets. And in it happens here where people are given one-way bus tickets to Eugene. So I would love to see a legal challenge to that.
Time for one more question.
My question is about legislation. Where does that legislative remedy stand? I don't know if there's a statute in Oregon that prohibits this kind of punishment, criminal punishment, and if they're trying to change that.
Ed, do you want to say a few words about HB 3115?
Yeah, so Oregon does have a law, ORS 195-530, that provides some fundamental protection to our neighbors who are living outside. If cities want to regulate life-sustaining activity, they have to do so in a way that is objectively reasonable from the perspective of people experiencing homelessness. But I think nationally we need legislation on a couple of fronts. There is a bill called the Gloria Johnson Act, named after one of our named plaintiffs, that has gotten traction so far in at least 6 states, that really provides more specific protection for people living outside. But the one thing the legislature can do is fund affordable housing. And right after this opinion came down, the entire Oregon congressional delegation, along with many other federally elected officials, wrote a letter to the Biden administration and asked for legislation that would create funding for a wide variety of affordable housing programs, including reforming the tax credit program, which alone might create 2 million more units of affordable housing.
Well, thank you, everyone. We are out of time, and I want to take a moment to thank our panelists for their presentations.